A few months ago, I made a video comparing the shocking cost of buying and running a electric Mini Cooper S versus a gasoline Mini Cooper S. Now, for my small channel, the 180,000 views that video got was surprisingly successful. But the Mini is a small car and it has a short range, only 114 miles according to the EPA, and that puts it right off the shopping list of many people. But with a recent price drop, I decided to take a look at the Chevrolet Bolt. Now, this is a vehicle with 259 miles of EPA range. It has an extra set of doors on the back, so it has a usable back seat. It is physically a much larger vehicle and more practical. And it actually costs less to buy than the Mini, unless you're eligible for tax credits. So today we're going to take a look at an EV that costs more than the gasoline equivalent. Specifically, we're going to look at a 2022 Chevrolet Bolt, and I'm going to compare that with a 2022 Chevrolet Trax. The Trax is the smallest crossover SUV, whatever term you care to use, that Chevrolet makes. It costs over $4,000 less than the electric Chevrolet Bolt. Despite costing less, it's physically a bigger vehicle. It's basically 4 inches longer than the Bolt, so it seems like you're definitely getting a really good deal. Or at least it does until you take a look at the interior. The interior volume of the Bolt is basically 94 cubic feet, and it's 93 cubic feet for the Trax. This is because the Bolt is on a true EV platform. They didn't just take some batteries and shove it into a gasoline vehicle. And because of that, you get things like lower floors, no transmission tunnels, less space up front needed for an engine, and so on. And this also shows in the legroom. The Bolt has nearly 4 inches more legroom in the front, although a similar amount in the rear. And while the cargo volume with the back seat up is ever so slightly less on the Bolt, when you fold the seats down, it's substantially larger. So despite being a physically shorter vehicle, you get more space inside, which is really all that matters. So yes, you're paying over $4,000 more for the Bolt versus the Trax, but you are technically getting more space for your money. I could have compared the Bolt to a slightly larger crossover from Chevrolet, but that would actually cost more money. The bigger vehicle, you pay more for it. And I really wanted to try to give the gas vehicle choice here as much of a benefit as I could. So I went with the cheapest thing that Chevrolet sell. In the prices, the MSRP, including the destination charge, and in the case of the Trax, I also added $400 for a pack that includes cruise control, because most people want cruise control and it is standard on the Bolt. So we know the purchase price of both vehicles, so now let's look at some of the running costs. So the battery in the Volt is 65 kilowatt hours, whereas the gas tank in the Trax is 14 gallons. The Bolt gets 259 miles of range on that battery, which works out at 4 miles per kilowatt hour. The Trax gets 392 miles of range on its gas tank because it gets 28 miles per gallon, and it requires, I believe, regular fuel. These are the numbers from the EPA. To calculate the cost of fuel, which varies wildly across the US, I'm actually using the US national average as of mid-July when I'm recording this. Electricity prices per kilowatt hour at the home are just under 15 cents, so I rounded it up to 15 cents, and apparently gasoline averages $4.57 across the nation. This means it costs $11.70 to fill, as it were, the battery in the Bolt, and $63.98 to fill the gas tank in the Trax. Based on their range, that means it costs 4.5 cents per mile to run the Bolt in terms of fueling it, as it were, and 16.3 cents to run the Trax. Now, maintenance is a little tricky to calculate, especially for the Bolt, which I'll come back to in a minute. But for the Trax, I basically found a website which gives maintenance cost details of various cars. I simply plugged in the Chevrolet Trax, and it basically told me that over 3 years, we'd spend just over $1,000 on both repairs and maintenance. 5 years would be $2,200, and over 8 years, it'd be just under $5,500. They don't have any information for the Bolt, despite the fact it's been out for a few years. There may be many reasons for that, not enough vehicles sold, and also the fact that really there isn't much in the way of maintenance to do on the Bolt. You might, if you're sensible, take it in once a year just so that they can take a look underneath, make sure nothing's leaking, not that there's much to leak, make sure the suspension looks okay, rotate the tyres, fill the washer fluid, change the wiper blades. That's pretty much all they're going to do to it. So I just put in some numbers based on that kind of service at 200 over 3 years, 500 over 5 years, and 800 over 8 years. In other words, $100 a year for someone to just take a quick look over it. As with my video comparing the gasoline and electric Mini, I'm not taking into account the cost of repairing things that are common across both vehicles. So for example, the electric window could fail in the Bolt, and that would mean that you'd spend more on maintenance, but it could also fail in the Trax. And it's a GM electric window, so they're pretty much the same. The same thing goes for the air conditioning, or the speaker in the door, or the power locks. It's not relevant to this comparison because there's an equal chance of it going wrong on both vehicles. I'm just talking about maintenance and repairs on the drivetrain. Okay, so we'll take the numbers from the previous slide and we'll now calculate what it costs to own one of these vehicles over, various time periods and mileages. So we've got the purchase prices. If we look at 10,000 miles a year, just for the sake of argument, 3 years, 30,000 miles, what's it going to cost to fuel these vehicles? Well, it's going to cost just over $1,400 in electricity to run the Bolt, and it's going to cost nearly $4,900 to put gas in the Chevy Trax. Maintenance and repairs over 3 years, again, as we've already seen, $200 on the Bolt, basically $1,000 on the Trax. And that means that over 3 years, including buying the vehicle, and of course the Bolt is well over $4,000 more expensive to buy, but over 3 years, if you look at everything, they basically cost the same. It comes in at $28,500 for both. Another important factor to consider, though, is the resale value. Now, I personally think that electric vehicles will have a higher resale value than the gasoline vehicles. And I mean, in terms of percentage of value retained. Currently, the used market proves that out, but in case I'm wrong, we'll just treat both of them the same. We'll say that they both will retain 70% of their value over 3 years. And so we'll assume that you sell it. In this case, you'd get just over $18,800 for the Bolt, and you'd get $15,800 for the Trax. So the total cost, buying it, running it, selling it, comes to $9,677 on the Bolt and $12,690 on the Trax. Essentially, it's $3,000 cheaper over 3 years to have the Bolt than the Trax. If we look at it over a longer period, in this case 5 years, 50,000 miles, and we assume that the cars are only worth 50% of their original price, then you're talking just over $16,000 total for the Bolt over that period versus over $21,000 to buy, run the Trax. Going to 8 years and 80,000 miles, we're now at 30% retained value, for example, just over $23,000 on the Bolt and just over $34,000 on the Trax. Basically $11,000 of difference. Essentially, the more miles you put on the car, the more years, the longer you have it, it just more and more becomes in favor of the EV. So in a sort of quick summary, over 3 years, 30,000 miles, going with the Bolt should save you about $3,000. Over 5 years or 50,000 miles, the Bolt is saving you $5,400. And over 8 years, 80,000 miles, the Bolt is saving you a whopping $11,000. Again, you would need to run these numbers for yourself using the cost of electricity that you pay on your plan and the cost of gasoline at the gas station near you. But before I close out the video, I did want to consider finance, because most cars are, they're not bought. You don't walk in there with cash. Most people in America will finance a vehicle. And I did get some comments on the previous video with the Mini where I only look at the cash price and they say, well, that's great, but I don't have that kind of money. I have to finance the car. And honestly, whether you pay cash or finance it, it doesn't really change these numbers. So with that in mind, let's take a look at finance. Now, finance is kind of tricky to calculate because I don't know your personal situation. Do you have money to put down? How much can you put down? Do you have a vehicle to trade in? Are you going to finance it over 3 years, 4, 5, 6? Do you have good credit, average credit, whatever that is, bad credit? All this stuff affects the monthly price, but at least it will affect both vehicles basically the same. So for this example, I'm going to assume that you have a vehicle to trade in or a down payment equivalent to 20% of what it costs to get a Trax. So that's roughly $4,500, right? Which I'll just put down as a trade-in value here. To keep those monthly payments down, I'm going to assume that you would be financing over 5 years or 60 months. And I'm just going to take the standard APR as given by the Chevrolet finance calculator here. This puts the Trax down at $329 per month. If we assume the same down payment, the same interest rate, the same length of loan and so on, that means that we're putting $4,500 down on a more expensive vehicle. So that means that the amount that we need to finance is higher because we're buying a more expensive vehicle and we're only putting the same down payment. That means that you're financing 23% more money with the Bolt than with the Trax. So I'm going to basically say that the monthly payment would be 23% higher. So I'm just going to estimate the Bolt at $407 per month, which is pretty much $80 more than the Trax. If you're going to finance the vehicle over 5 years, 50,000 miles, then let's look at the running costs over 5 years and 50,000 miles, right? And we're going to break this down from the previous page. We're going to break this down into the monthly costs. So initially, we look at just the car payment. So that's $407 for the Bolt and $329 for the Trax. Now, most people, if you were sitting in the dealership finance department and they gave you those two numbers, you'd look at it and be like, wow, $80 a month more. Can't afford an EV. I'll stick with the Trax because I just can't afford it. You're going to see that that's really not the case, and it's very important that you do these sums for yourself before you sign the dotted line on finance for, well, anything really. If we look at the monthly fuel cost and break it down, it works out to be $39 in charging per month for the Bolt. In other words, your electricity bill is going to increase by $39, but of course you won't have a gas bill. Whereas the Trax is going to cost $136 per month in gasoline. That's close to $100 in fuel savings per month. So the fact that you're paying $80 more for the car, but saving $100 a month in fuel means that you are net $20 better off with the Bolt than the Trax. And that was probably non-obvious, at least when you were sitting in the finance department of the dealership. Also, we can break down the maintenance and repairs. Now, clearly, you might take the car in for annual maintenance. So you have 11 months of no payments and then, 1 month of a big bill. So let's just divide it up to make it even throughout the entire period. Also, you'll have no repairs in the first year. You might have some repairs, in the fifth year. So again, let's just make it even across the entire period just for ease of demonstrating the numbers. That basically means that the Bolt comes in at $8 a month in maintenance and repairs because I don't expect there to be any. And again, we are not including anything outside the drivetrain here. So if the power locks fail on the Bolt, that would be not covered by this amount. If the power locks fail on the Trax, it's not covered by the amount here either. But just in regular maintenance and statistically expected failures on the drivetrain, you're looking at $37 a month for the Trax. So again, a difference of about $30. That means your monthly total, what it's actually going to cost you, is around $454 per month for the Bolt and $502 for the Trax. So that means you save $48 a month by going with the Bolt. So that means, again, over the 5 years, you're going to save $2,880. And again, after that 5 years, we have this higher residual value, assuming the vehicle is only worth 50% of what you paid new. Essentially, the Bolt is worth $2,150 more than the Trax will be. And that gives combined total savings of financing, running, and then selling over 5 years, a saving of $5,000 by going with the Bolt, which if we go back to the original savings chart here, 5 years, if you paid cash, so no interest payments, the Bolt was going to save $5,400. This is why when I'm making these videos, I'm not going to calculate it based on finance. It doesn't actually change the numbers. Just be aware that if you are financing, you'll probably see the savings from month one instead of having to wait to recover the cost of the vehicle. So that's that. I'm going to do more of these videos where I compare an electric option versus the closest gasoline option from various manufacturers. I'm less inclined to do videos about the more expensive vehicles. I think if you can afford to spend, $80,000 on a vehicle, do you care if it's cheaper to run than a gas vehicle at $80,000? Kind of get the impression that you're buying it because you want it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But certainly on the lower end of the market and up to the mid-level market, I want to run these numbers to compare because it may seem on face value that the EV option is more expensive because upfront it looks like it can be. But you can see that when you actually do the math, monthly, you are better off going with the more expensive EV than with the gas car.